Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the Dune trailer graphics tutorial. This time we're going to continue breaking down the background elements and also focus more on the text, including how I used one of my favorite Sapphire effects, Blur Motion, to create the ghostly look on the text. So let's get started. These geometric shapes and animated lines are a really striking part of the Dune trailer. And it was a nice challenge to try and recreate something that looked kind of similar in After Effects. And I've used two different techniques. I've used the Vegas effect and I've used shape layers. So let's just jump straight into that composition. Lines. And I'm just going to solo this bottom layer. So as soon as I made out that there were kind of moving lines on these shapes in the trailer, the first thing I thought of was Vegas, because Vegas is designed to have kind of running lights along a mask. And if I just turn on the mask so we can see that, I've got a hexagonal mask here, just created by choosing the polygon tool and dragging in the comp. Applying the Vegas effect, and I've set segments down to 3. The default is much higher than that. If I just reset that, normally it's 32, which gives you a lot more segments. I only wanted a couple of them, and I've actually used the expression for time on rotation, using that a lot in this project. So time times -5. So this is the result. The nice thing about Vegas is it has this nice tail or fall off at the end of each segment. So I ended up going with Vegas for a few different shapes. I did a square and I did a circle. Literally just by duplicating this solid and replacing the mask with a different shape. As I was doing that, I was thinking, well, maybe there's a way to use shape layers as well. And I remembered the trim paths operator in shape layers, and that would give you a very similar result. So I decided to try some shape layers. First one here is Hexes and Triangles. Just have a look at the shape layers again. Now, I drew these using the pen tool, just making sure that this option here, Tool Create Shape, was checked. And these ones come up and around in a triangular shape and come down. And there's one sort of hexagonal one that comes this way and up and down and out. And I noticed a similar sort of look in the trailer, so that's why I created these shapes. So let's take a look at the settings. Just going to control click on contents. And if I open that, that's going to close all of those groups. I'll just turn all these off. All right, so I've got two groups here, group A and group B, and I've got trim paths sandwiched in between. So the trim paths operator is only going to work on the group that's above trim paths. To create a group, I've just clicked on Add and chosen Group. And I've dragged into Group A my triangle, 1A and 2A, and also my hex shape. Now these are made up of a path, obviously, and also a stroke. I've done a couple of things to the stroke. See, it's very fine. It's almost difficult to see. Stroke width is 0.5, and I've used the dashes setting. If I turn dashes off and also turn wave off, there's my stroke. I'll just turn off these two just for now. So there's my stroke, as you'd expect it if I didn't have any dashes or wave turned on. So with dashes turned on, that gives me 1, 2, 3, 4 dashes. And I created those by just coming down here and clicking on the plus button, then increasing the dash amount. It's going to hide my mask. If I click it again, you also get a gap amount. It's going to undo that and bring back my original settings. And I've broken those lines up a little bit more by using wave. Remember, we saw wave in tutorial 1 when I applied it to that crescent shape. And in that case, I was making kind of a dashed line. Here what I'm doing is I'm using a much larger wavelength. If I bring that down, there's my dashed line. But at a larger wavelength, what it's doing is kind of breaking up these lines. You can see I get this kind of fall off, similar to what Vegas was doing with those segments. Just trying to break up those lines a little bit. I thought about maybe using a fractal noise mat to sort of break them up, but Waves actually allowed me to do it inside the shape layer itself. So a combination of dashes and wave just gives me the sort of basic triangle shape without being an obvious, fully complete triangle. So there's a couple of different shapes in here, and that's the result that we get. So remember, these ones are going to be modified by the trim paths operator. And once again, adding trim paths by coming up here and choosing Add, Trim Paths. And the trim paths operator has the offset animated. You can see once again, time. So that'll make the paths appear to be moving around those shapes. And it's only affecting the ones on top. Now to fill in the areas that have been trimmed out or cropped out due to the dashes and waves, I've added Group B underneath. So Group B is basically all the same shapes. Just turn off Group A. And obviously they're not being trimmed anymore. But you can see I'm not using any dashes. I'm only using wave, and I'm using a slightly higher wavelength. So we're getting completed strokes all the way around the shapes, but we have all these softer areas as well, these more transparent areas. So the result of these two groups with trim paths, you get slightly brighter paths on top, or strokes on top, which are moving, and you get these slightly finer lines below. I'm going to check if I adjusted the opacity of these. Here you can see for Group B, I've brought the opacity of that group down. So you can adjust the opacity of groups individually. If I bring it up, it makes it too bright. So that's the result that we get. So I wanted it to have the appearance of movement on the lines, but I didn't want it to be super obvious. And once I set up one, it was pretty much a case of just changing the shapes. You can see Group A, Group B for circles. And same for arches. Group A, Group B, and so on. So let me just bring all of those back now. So by combining all of these together, you get this look. Now the dotted circles were once again referenced from the trailer. Pretty much the same kind of thing. This time I've got 5 different groups. Let me just turn these off. So I created one with a stroke, and the stroke is once again using dashes. But you can see by adding a dash and a gap and leaving the dash at 0 and then changing the gap, I can create dots. You can get dots that are further apart by increasing the gap, or dots that are really close together. The important thing here is that the dash is set to 0. And once again with the trim paths, offset animated using the time expression, and we get that dotted line moving around that circle. Then it was just a case of duplicating that group and just making some adjustments to start and end so that these lines were offset. And also scaling that ellipse so that they were offset as well. Shape layers are great for creating these kind of graphic elements. If we come back to the main composition, I've applied the fill effect just with this very pale orange, and also Sapphire blur. I was getting a little bit of aliasing, especially with these very thin diagonal lines, so a little bit of Sapphire blur just helps soften that up. And obviously in the trailer there's a lot more detail, there's way more geometric shapes, and there's so much more happening. They would have spent a lot more time than I did on this, but I thought using Vegas in this way with different mask shapes and using different shape layers with trim paths actually gave a pretty effective result. And I have used particle illusion to add a few extra lines using the brand new lines feature in Particle Illusion 2021. Let's take a look at that. So the particles are all of these layers here. And if you have a look at the trailer, you'll notice there's a lot of different particles floating around. So let's just take a look at this lines one. So I'll just turn these ones off. We'll come to lines 4, and I'll just launch Particle Illusion. You can already see them in the comp there. They're very subtle. Now the new lines feature in Particle Illusion 2021 is really easy to use, and it gives you some great new creative options. And to apply lines, we come down to the particle. And just here under Alpha, you can see there's a new lines category, and I have Connect Particles checked. So this is adding lines between the particles. With Connect Particles selected, I get a max line length option, and I can either increase that to add more lines or decrease it to get a lot fewer lines. I've also brought the opacity right down, so line opacity can be adjusted independently of the particle. And you can see you can't even see the actual particle. I've brought the size of the particle right down. And if I press play, it's basically stationary because you may have noticed I've increased life to about 1,000. So particles are being born and they're living for a long time. And I've also keyframed the number. So we start with 1,000 particles, and 1 frame later, we have 0. So that's a good way to create particles at the very beginning of your animation and increase their life to a really high number, and then they'll just hang around for ages. And that's allowed me to create this nice graphical element. So I've been able to add that extra bit of line detail really easily without having to go ahead and duplicate the shape layers or Vegas multiple times. There is another one on top of that. And this one's just slightly larger. It's really difficult to see here, but just a little bit extra. So it's basically exactly the same, just a slightly larger emitter with that max line length just reduced, so there's fewer lines. So a great creative option in Continuum 2021, and also in the standalone version of Particle Illusion. Now these PI ring dots also add an extra layer of detail. Let me just turn one of these on. Might just turn these guys off. So this is the same as the lines versions, but I haven't got lines turned on. Let's just open up one of these. So in these ones, you can actually see the particles because I've increased the particle size. As with the lines, velocity is down at 0. If I increase the number, let's just bring that up. You can see they're sitting on that circle emitter. And the life has been decreased, making the particles be born and die, and that's giving you that sort of flickering look, sort of flickering light look. Not too much. If I brought life down too low, they'd be really flickering like crazy. If I increase velocity, you can see they'll start to move away from that emitter. But I wanted them to hug that emitter nice and tightly and not have very many at all. Because I knew once I created one, I was going to duplicate it and just change the emitter size. I've also added some rotation once again using the time expression. So we get this series of rings. and they're all rotating. Let's just preview that. And you can see the middle one is rotating in the opposite direction. So once again, using particle illusion, just with really basic settings, just to add that extra graphical element. And this probably could have been done using shape layers, but it was much easier to do in particle illusion. Just turn these other layers back on. So that's all of the objects that make up the background. Let's go back to the text now, and I want to walk through how I set up that text treatment. We've already looked at the two Title Studio text layers here, just solo these ones. So we looked at these in tutorial 1, and there's a number of other TS layers down here. So I think I'll just solo this one here. I'll just add these ones back in. Now looking at the trailer, there's a really nice sort of echo distort effect on the letters. And I tried a number of different things, but I wasn't really able to recreate what they'd done in that animation. And I'm quite interested to know how the artist who created that look actually achieved that effect. So rather than do a really poor version of that, I've done something that looks kind of similar using one of my favorite effects in Sapphire, which is blur motion. So to this version of the Title Studio text, I've applied Sapphire Distort and Sapphire Blur Motion. And I have a curves effect on here, which it looks like I've left turned off. So I'll leave that turned off. Just turn these ones off. So Sapphire Distort is a really useful distortion effect. And you can see down here, I've keyframed the blur lens parameter. So it's quite distorted. And as the text rotates into place, that distortion is animated down to 0. And I follow that with Sapphire Blur Motion. So Blur Motion is a motion blur effect. And it has some parameters that I find really useful, which are these from and to rotate options, and also the Z-dist, the from Z-dist and to Z-dist option. And on this particular version, I've only used the to Z-dist and from Z-dist, just to give me some of that streakiness. But on top of that, I've used blur motion again, and I've really pushed out the from Z-dist. You can see how that's given that really nice rotated streaky look. So I've keyframed from Z-dist and from to rotate, and also the brightness. And this is where Sapphire Blur Motion really shines. So you can see how animating that rotation makes it look like the letters are kind of swinging into place, or they've animated through space and they've left this kind of trail behind them. And this obviously isn't in the trailer, but I just took a little bit of creative license and added this in. Let's just turn back on these background layers. So it's already starting to look better. It just needed a little bit more detail on these letters. And to do that, I've actually split it up into the individual letters. Turn these on. And I've used blur motion again, and the reason I've split these up is because blur motion has an effect control point, and I wanted the effect to be centered around each letter individually. On the other blur motion layers, it didn't matter that the effect control point was in the center of the text. That's kind of what I wanted. But for this particular look, I needed it centered around these letters. Let's just actually solo these. You see what I mean? See how it's rotating around the center point of the letters? Just drag my time indicator. I've keyframed from rotate and brightness, so they're a little bit brighter at the start. And as we progress through the animation, they rotate back into position. And that was only possible because I've applied blur motion to the individual letters. And the combination of these blur motion layers gives us that really nice ghostly superimposed look. And I love how this sweep version just adds some depth to this animation. It really looks like this is sort of swept in from a distance. And the last thing I added to the text was the lens flare on the E. And that was created using Sapphire lens flare. Let's just turn that on. And that just sits behind the sphere that's used to make up the letter E. Clicking Edit Lens will open up the Flare Designer. And I've just created a really simple flare here, just using a hotspot and also a few versions of rays. So I've just added the rays and just set it down to only use a ray number of 1. Let's turn those off. So I've got the initial ray and then one on top of that, which is slightly longer. And then another one on top, which is just slightly thicker, but the opacity has been dropped down, which adds a bit of glow to it. And also there's a little spot that I noticed in the trailer that sits in here. So that just sits behind the sphere, and you can see the effect control point here. If I just press U, that's the hotspot XY property, and that's where the hotspot sits. And I've just added a few manual keyframes just to have that move along with the sphere. And I could have motion tracked that, but sometimes it's just as easy just to add a couple of keyframes in. So as the text rotates and also the camera moves into position, that sphere moves, so the flare also needs to move. Now there's also a duplicate of this layer. Just double click this. So this is the Tyler Studio text again. I've called this E dot and I've added a mask. So I've just masked that out and I've filled that with black. So you get this kind of silhouetted effect. It's not as visible in the very beginning. It just sort of fades in. So we can see the sphere a little more clearly at the start, and then that just fades in as the lens flare gets brighter. And I did duplicate that layer just to add a bit of extra glow, and I've followed lens flare with a bit of sapphire blur. So it's very subtle, but it just adds a little bit of extra glow over that lens flare. And the very last step, just to reduce the saturation slightly, was an adjustment layer with Sapphire's Hue Sat Bright effect, and just very subtly decreasing the saturation. I just felt that the overall result was a little bit too warm. That just pulls that back a little bit, more in line with what the trailer has. So it doesn't look exactly like the trailer, but it definitely was fun to create, and it was really nice to use that trailer as some inspiration to explore some of the possibilities in After Effects using Sapphire and Continuum. So thanks for watching, and be sure to visit borisfx.com to take a free trial of Sapphire or Continuum, and to see more videos about all of the Boris FX products.